For the last decades, the US has been the world's unchallenged economic and military superpower. However, following 2016, things started to change, and it looks like more drastic changes are on the way for 2026. These changes will be divided on three different levels. Firstly, being the economical level, with Trump's trade war with China. Secondly, the political level regarding the US policy in the Middle East and what's happening in Ukraine, especially looking at the latest developments. With that, we will end with some of the internal challenges that the United States is currently facing, which might be quite key in 2026. This will help us understand whether the old US empire is slowly falling in order to let another empire take over. Before we continue, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get back to us. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the US has been undisputed. With 20% of the global GDP and 40% of the world's military spending, the US was simply unchallengeable. However, whilst the US growth has never ended, it got substantially slower, especially post the year 2000. In the other part of the world, Beijing was growing substantially. In fact, in the year 2000, it reached 8% of GDP growth just in 1 year. Whilst China's growth is also slowing down, what's scary for the United States is the prospect of this growth. In fact, the challenge here is not only economic, but it's also a military challenge, a technological challenge, and a diplomatic one. So, in simple terms, what happened here is that China started to grow, firstly by a quantity growth, and this was followed with a quality growth. What we mean by quality growth is that at some point China wasn't satisfied anymore with having a simple manufacturing industry, so it decided to invest in a more complex technological-based industry. So what happened in simple terms is that one day China decided that it didn't want to produce cheap purses anymore, and instead it would want to move to producing electric vehicles, trains, and complex AI systems. In fact, it was at this point that a serious rivalry started to form between the US and China. In addition, what was more aggravating for the US is that China wasn't producing all these things for its national market, but it was trading with the world as a member of the WTO. In fact, ever since China joined the WTO, it became one of the main exporters for entire continents such as Africa and Europe, to a point where China is now involved in major infrastructural projects for several African nations, which from a US perspective now represents a clear strategic threat to the US historical hegemony in the continent. All of this brings us to the Trump era, where, according to Trump, all of these threats cannot be ignored anymore and they have to be dealt with in some way. And according to Trump, this way is through a trade war that will gain the US its hegemony back. So what we understand from this is that the current trade war isn't just a political choice as much as it's the product of a long-term American stagnation added to a constant sentiment of Chinese economic threat. But before discussing what this means for 2026, it's important to also look at what forged America's superpower status, with one of the reasons being America's interventionist policy. However, in the long term, interventionism carries also some side effects. Side effects that could vary from human cost to economic cost or even reputational and political cost. In fact, it's estimated that the economic cost of the US wars just in the last 20 years has been that of $5.8 trillion. Something that Trump has been known for opposing. However, during his term, it didn't seem like much changed. In fact, it seems that the US and Israel have been discussing a potential strike to carry out against Iran. An idea that's become quite appealing to the Israelis, especially given the current protests that are taking place all over Iran. which have made the regime substantially more fragile. A strike that could lead to a war that the US is being very careful about entering in 2026. This following 2 years of both direct and indirect interventions that the US has been carrying out in different parts of the Middle East. One being its direct support to Israel's campaign against Gaza, which seriously damaged the US reputation in the world and created a strong international outrage. Beyond the high economic cost and the reputational damage for the US, these wars, specifically what happened in Gaza, has now led to serious political consequences. Consequences that have made many doubt the rule-based system that the US created in the post-World War II era. So another intervention wouldn't be ideal for the US international reputation and legitimacy. However, not all of the US international involvement has been strategically bad. In fact, whilst in the Middle East, the US prospect for 2026 doesn't look good, in Ukraine, it's quite different, as the US has successfully managed to carry out a powerful proxy war against its rival Russia. Not only that, but it managed to do it without setting foot in the battleground. So despite the focus that many put on the fact that Donald Trump is now trying to get out of the war, as the economic cost for the West, but specifically for the United States, has been very high, in reality, this war has created a powerful strategic advantage for the US against Russia by setting back the Russian army and capacity by decades. In fact, it's estimated that since its invasion, Russia has lost more than 10,000 military vehicles and more than 250,000 of its men. So, regardless of the catastrophic human and economic outcome of this war for Ukraine, it seems that the US is succeeding in achieving its target of giving a powerful setback to Russia. So, regardless of the nature of the settlement that Putin and Trump will achieve over the war in Ukraine, it seems that the US has already accomplished its strategic gain. Meaning that if a settlement is reached in 2026, the US will be able to focus its resources and attention on its race against China. And this also includes any possible military scenarios in Taiwan. However, whilst what happens outside is definitely important for the US, what's even more important is what happens inside. This is valid for the national economy as well as the internal political affairs. In fact, it seems that post-2015, the US has been consistently growing in terms of political polarization. And with social inequality constantly rising, this issue is only going to get worse, especially when you take it and combine it to the already existent economic problems within the US economy. One problem that can't be ignored anymore is the US national debt, which is now approaching a staggering $39 trillion. Interest payments on this debt are becoming one of the largest items in the federal budget, crowding out spending on infrastructure, education, and defense, all marking an economic instability that the world is clearly starting to notice, with one effect of this being the record surge that the prices of gold have seen in the last 3 months, a surge that is only expected to continue in the next 3 months of 2026. But financial problems are just a symptom of a deeper disease. In fact, a house divided against itself cannot stand. By 2026, American political polarization has moved beyond disagreement into open hostility. The political system is paralyzed, incapable of passing the long-term reforms needed to fix the debt or rebuild the industrial base. Identity politics and culture wars have fractured the American social contract. History teaches us a brutal lesson. Powerful empires rarely fall from a single external push. They rot from the inside, paralyzed by debt, division, and decadence. until a stiff breeze is all it takes to topple them. In 2026, the US is still standing on a solid ground, a ground from which it will try to project more of its power. In fact, whilst in Ukraine it seems that the US will be able to close its strategic victory, it still has some important challenges. The first being its trade war against China, in which the US will try to isolate China by further leveraging its economic and geopolitical influence. To do this at best, the US will firstly have to deal with some of the other challenges that it's facing, such as Iran or Venezuela, which, by the way, as we make this video, is being attacked by the US in a clear attempt to deal with this specific issue early on in the year, so they can put their focus on China. However, the biggest out of them all is the internal threat, as it is clear that the US internal politics is becoming more violent and divided by the time. Whilst this video can't offer any solutions to this problem, it is becoming clear that some form of solution is needed before this becomes a serious problem for the US stability. With this, I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more, please hit like and subscribe. Bye.